little fox.
Little Men, Chapter 21, The Harvest. In September, the children harvested their Plumfield gardens, and what a bountiful harvest it was! Demi was able to send boxes of turnips to his grandparents, while Jack had so much corn and potatoes, he was thinking of selling them.
I'll be glad to buy your potatoes, because we go through pounds of that vegetable every week,
Mr. Bauer said. Daisy's garden had bloomed from spring to fall, and she regularly sent bouquets to her parents, Meg and John Brooks. No matter the weather, she faithfully tended her roses, zinnias, and other flowers. Rob had grown 4 small squash and 1 gigantic pumpkin, which was so large 2 small children could sit on it. Not that he let anyone sit on it. Instead, Rob babied the giant fruit, protecting it from the frost with an old quilt.
Your pumpkin will provide us with plenty of Thanksgiving pies,
Joe said.
I can think of another use for it too, but that's a surprise.
Nan had grown herbs, and her garden had bloomed with useful plants. Now she was busy cutting and drying her harvest. She also kept a little book where she wrote down the uses for different herbs.
I don't want to poison one of my patients with the wrong herb,
she said. Meanwhile, Tommy had neglected the beans he'd planted. When rain was scarce, he hadn't watered them, and then he'd let weeds and pests overtake them. By midsummer, his bean crop had failed. He'd next planted peas, but it was too late in the season for them to grow. All he succeeded in growing were thistles, which Toby the donkey liked to eat.
Next year, I'm just going to grow thistles for Toby,
Tommy announced. In contrast, Nat had a bumper crop of beans.
What a lot of beans you've grown,
Joe said, admiring his overflowing baskets.
This was my first garden, and I planted too many beans,
Nat said, shaking his head.
It's going to take me forever to shell all of them.
Leave it to me,
Joe said with a smile. Later that day, a notice appeared on the barn door, inviting everyone to a dance on Saturday night.
Casual attire.
Nan read the words aloud.
And take off your shoes at the door.
Daisy studied the sign with a disappointed expression.
I guess that means we can't wear our best dresses,
she said. But her face brightened as she read the rest of the notice.
Oh, it says Nat is going to play his violin!
On Saturday night, the barn floor was covered with Nat's beans.
Come on in, everybody!
He called to his friends, who were taking off their shoes.
Mrs. Bauer came up with a great idea for shelling my beans. All you have to do is dance on the pods, and the beans will be shelled. Ready?
The children laughed, and Nat began to play. The beans were quickly shelled, and everyone helped Nat discard the pods. Then they danced until it was time for bed. The only person who did not have a garden was Dan, because he'd been away for much of the summer. When the others harvested their crops, he looked sad that he had nothing to offer. But as autumn went on, he thought of a different kind of harvest. Every Saturday, he went off to the forests, fields, and hills and returned with armloads of treasures.
You bring the woods to me,
said Jo, who now spent her Saturday afternoons arranging Dan's colorful leaves, grasses, and berries.
I hope you don't mind, but I put some nuts in the attic,
Dan said.
There are walnuts, chestnuts, and hazelnuts, all in separate boxes that cover half the attic floor.
Nan's herbs are up there too, hanging to dry. And Jack is storing corn for popping, while Daisy is putting packets of flower seeds in an old dresser.
Joe laughed.
We have plenty to be thankful for in the attic, and it's not even Thanksgiving yet.
Dan was not the only one gathering nuts. A huge butternut tree grew on the property, and Mr. Bauer had promised the nuts to Rob and Teddy.
I'm going to pick the most nuts,
Teddy said one day as he worked. But he soon grew tired and left his basket on the lawn.
Have you and Teddy given up?
Silas asked Rob a few days later.
The squirrels are busy gathering nuts and they won't leave you any.
Oh, Silas, there are plenty of nuts for us,
Rob said. Silas shook his head as he said,
Most of them have fallen, and the squirrels have carried them away.
Rob was alarmed to see that Silas was right.
Come on, Teddy, we have to pick nuts right now.
The boys worked hard all afternoon, while the squirrels chattered at them from the tree. Right before supper, they put the last of the nuts in a little shed.
There, we're done,
Rob said. But the squirrels had not given up. The next day, Silas took the boys out to the shed.
I noticed your squirrel friends kept dropping onto the roof and disappearing.
Silas said.
Then I saw one poke its head out of a hole. It was carrying one of your nuts.
They're not squirrel friends.
Rob cried.
They're squirrel thieves.
I'll help you move the nuts.
Silas said.
But you need a better hiding place.
Up in the attic.
Teddy said.
That's where my daddy stores his nuts.
Little Men, Chapter 24, Happy Thanksgiving. That year, the children were especially proud of their contributions to Thanksgiving dinner.
My herbs made the stuffing really delicious,
Nan said with her mouth full. Jack scooped another potato onto his plate and said,
These are the best potatoes I've ever eaten.
Has everyone had some of my beans?
Nat asked.
Of course.
Tommy said.
You grew so many that Asia said we must all eat 3 helpings.
The pies came from my giant pumpkin.
Rob said.
And wait till you see.
Hush!
Daisy said, giving her cousin a gentle swat.
It's a surprise!
But the professor had overheard them and was curious.
Daisy, I know you helped bake many pies, but Rob's pumpkin was enormous. What did you do with the rest of it?
Well,
Daisy hesitated. Dan rescued Daisy by handing a bowl of nuts to Mr. Bauer.
Sir, try these.
The professor looked down at the table, murmuring to Joe,
Everyone seems to be in on this secret except me. But I can't wait.
After dinner, they all went for a long walk. Then they waited impatiently for the rest of the family to arrive. Mr. and Mrs. March, Aunt Meg and baby Josie, Uncle Laurie and Aunt Amy, with Bess and a special guest.
Mr. Hyde!
Dan exclaimed, immediately recognizing the naturalist.
What are you doing here?
I thought he'd like to see how well you're doing.
Laurie said.
We're so proud of you.
What a fine, polite young man you've turned into.
Mr. Hyde said to Dan. Dan and Mr. Hyde went to a parlor to talk until it was time for the evening's entertainment. Then everyone went into the schoolroom. where Jack amazed the audience by solving math problems in his head. Tommy won the spelling bee, and Dan performed gymnastics.
Dan's a strong lad.
Mr. Hyde said to the professor.
When I go to South America in a few years, I'd like to take him along.
Overhearing that remark, Dan smiled, grateful to both Mr. Hyde and the Bowers.
Where did the other children go?
The professor asked.
Back here!
Said a muffled voice behind a curtain made of blankets. Said more voices amid lots of giggles. The curtain rose to reveal Bess as Cinderella. Dressed in a ragged pinafore, she sat before a cardboard fireplace, not moving until Daisy whispered loudly,
Now! Oh, I wish I could go to the ball,
Cinderella said. Laurie clapped enthusiastically for his daughter, and Amy whispered, My little darling.
You must not speak to me,
Scolded Cinderella, looking at her parents. The back of the fireplace opened like a door, and Nan appeared as the fairy godmother. Dressed in a red cloak and pointed hat, she struggled to get through the opening.
You shall go to the ball,
The fairy godmother said, tapping Cinderella with her wand.
Now you must show my pretty dress.
Cinderella said, tugging on her pinafore.
No,
Nan said in her own voice.
First you say, how can I go in these rags? Oh, that's right,
Cinderella said, and repeated Nan's words. With that, the fairy godmother unfastened Cinderella's pinafore to reveal a beautiful pink dress. She placed a crown on Cinderella's head and gave her silver paper slippers.
But you have no coach,
The fairy godmother declared, waving her wand. Cinderella was too busy admiring her slippers to say her next line, so Silas just leaped into action from backstage.
Ready, Daisy?
He whispered.
Push!
Suddenly, 4 rats appeared, pulling a magnificent coach made from Rob's pumpkin and Teddy's wagon. As the coachman, Teddy helped Cinderella into the coach and squeezed in beside her. Cinderella waved to the audience, and that was the end of the first scene. In the ball scene, Rob played the prince, while Nan and Daisy were the stepsisters. The prince and Cinderella danced and danced, until finally, Nan had to whisper,
Cinderella, drop your shoe! Oops, I forgot,
gasped Cinderella, taking off a slipper and planting it in the middle of the stage before running away. In the last scene, the prince and the coachman arrived with the slipper, which didn't fit the stepsisters, only Cinderella.
I'm the princess,
Cinderella announced, running over to her parents.
Didn't I do a good job?
It was a beautiful play,
Laurie said.
And now I know what happened to the pumpkin.
The professor said with a smile. Following the play, Nat played a sweet song on his violin. When he finished, he bowed to Joe, saying,
Mr. Lawrence wrote that piece for you.
Oh, thank you, Laurie.
Joe said.
You're the one who deserves thanks.
Laurie said.
Look at what you've done for these children. Nat, Dan, and Nan, and the others are all so much better and so full of promise. And after John died, you comforted the twins as if they were your own children. When Bess is old enough, I want her to go to Plumfield.
Joe couldn't resist teasing him.
I thought you were unsure about boys and girls at school together.
Not anymore. And now you must excuse me for a moment.
Laurie said, slipping away. He soon returned with all the children, who formed a circle around Joe and the professor. Together they sang a Thanksgiving song, and at the end, the circle tightened into a hug. There was one plant that had taken root in all of Plumfield's gardens this year, and that was love.